It's great to see such a big scale project working with native plants. Thanks so much for sharing it with us. Right now we're going to be talking about water and watering appropriately, and I'm joined by Andrea DeLonga-Maya from the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center.
Hello, Tom.
Welcome back to the program, as always.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is a big topic, and you know there are lots of myths out there about watering in Texas, especially with summer coming on.
Yeah.
Confusion, right? Absolutely. And one of those things is something I'm sure you're familiar with at the Wildflower Center is that people believe that you can stick a native plant in the ground, turn around, walk away, and that's the end of the story.
In a few situations that could be true, like spineless prickly pear or a lot of the cacti you might be able to do that with. But yeah, mostly, almost everything you want to make sure that you water things to get them established, and how often that depends on the plant and what the conditions are on your site. Things like if it's a windy place, things are going to dry out obviously more quickly. If it's a sunny, dry place versus moist shade, what your soil is like is going to have a lot to do with that. Sandy soil drains pretty quickly. Clay will hold more moisture. Organic matter can hold more moisture. So there are a lot of factors. It's not an easy question to answer.
No, and I think the complexity of it really leads to a simple thing, though, that is know your garden.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
And a lot of gardeners start out enthusiastically looking at all these beautiful plants, and that's all they see. But really, the foundation of the garden is the soil, and knowing what kind of soil you have is a very good starting place. You mentioned sandy soils drain really quickly. You need to water a lot. But you can amend soils, clay, sand, whatever, by using compost and other kinds of things. And that's really critical.
Yeah, you can certainly do all of those things. I personally prefer to just find a plant that does well in those kinds of soil conditions and then skip a lot of the extra work of doing the soil amendments. But
choose well first.
Choose well first, right. If you get the right plant for the right space, and then watch the plants and build a relationship with your garden and with those plants, and learn how quickly things dry out, then that's really the best way. There's not an easy, like 1 inch per week, although that's maybe a good generalization, but it may be less or more depending on the situation.
Right, and and of course, the situation may mean that we just had a heavy rainfall where we did get maybe more than 1 inch of rain. That's something to celebrate, because you can lay off, for a while.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, and I hear this all the time from folks, is when I'm out watering my garden with a handheld hose, sometimes people say, "But Tom, it rained last night," and I want to say, "Yeah, for like a minute."
Right.
Yeah,
1/10 of an inch doesn't necessarily cut it. It doesn't go very deep.
So, let's give people some tips about how they might explore the moisture level of their soils. What would you recommend?
Well, I think the easiest way is to water, measure how much with a rain gauge, and then dig a hole and see how deep the moisture goes. That's going to depend, on your soil and those sort of things. And you want the moisture to go down to the root zone of the plant, so not just the top 1/4 of an inch. But if you have a perennial, the bulk of the roots are probably going to be within the first foot, maybe 1.5 feet, depending on the plants. There will be deep roots that go further down, but the bulk of the fibrous roots are going to be in that area. So if it stays, moist enough for that species, then you're good.
Right, and we always encourage people to use mulch, but it's kind of a double-edged sword sometimes, because you can put down a good thick layer of mulch, but they may prevent water from penetrating all the way down.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah, and if you have drip irrigation that's underneath the mulch, that's helpful. But when we get a rain, really thick mulch can inhibit that water from percolating down into the root zone of the plants.
It keeps the roots cool, which is great, but you just need to be aware that it may not be penetrating. So test.
Yeah.
Actually, pull back the mulch occasionally.
Yes, I think that's a good call, especially if we've had a lot of rain. You want to let your plants breathe a little bit so that things don't get too wet, because that has certainly happened before too. We get long stretches of rain, and just everything starts cratering.
Right.
And it depends also too on what kind of mulch you have. If something holds a lot of moisture, like some of the pine bark and bark mulches, stay wet for a longer time than a looser mulch like pecan mulch or something that drains through pretty quickly. Right.
Well, let's go back to new plants for a minute, because this is a situation where watering is especially critical, and I want to give people some good tips. One thing that and you said pay attention and kind of look at the plants. That's something I want to underscore, because a lot of times plants will let you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Definitely. One of the things that I learned early on in my gardening career is that a wilted plant doesn't necessarily mean that it's dry, and I try to warn people of that, especially this, early spring or mid-spring when plants are first coming out. They may have a lot of tender growth, and if you see a plant that's wilting, it may just be trying to acclimate to the sun. Just like the first time you go out to the beach after winter, you're going to get sunburn if you're not careful. It's the same idea.
That's a good point.
So a wilted plant may just be the plant's way of responding to the intense sun and heat, but it may not necessarily mean that it's dry. So feeling the soil, if it's still wilted first thing in the morning, it's probably because it's either too dry or maybe it's just been waterlogged and it's actually starting to rot. And that's a big danger. So it's really good to feel the soil and make sure you're not watering a plant that's already too soggy.
That's a really important point, because sometimes the look of a waterlogged plant looks like it's water deprived. So beware.
Yeah, that could be a big mistake.
Right. What I like, and I like to hand water in my garden. It works conveniently, and I can control how much water goes in. Occasionally during the summertime, I'll pull out a sprinkler at the appropriate time of day.
It's an efficient way to water too.
It's very efficient. And what I do with young plants, especially trees or new shrubs, woody shrubs, is I'll leave the water on, after I finish kind of doing the hand watering, I'll leave the hose out, put it on a trickle, and I'll let it sit a couple of feet away from the plant and let it just soak in for a long period of time so that the roots has something to go to.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think it's a good point too, that when you're watering woody plants, you don't want to just put the water source at the base of the trees, at the trunk. Most of the roots are going to be further out from the trunk of the tree. So generally you want to get a good soaking around the root zone, which generally would be the drip line of the plant, although it could be further than that too. But that's sort of the critical area that you want to make sure that gets moist.
Right, and when we say drip line, it's the furthest reach of the branches, basically, is what people should be looking for. And what I'll try to create kind of wet zones on either side of the plant, and that also encourages the roots to get out further, which is another survival thing for the plants.
And that makes them more drought resistant as time goes on. It's definitely better to do a deeper soaking less frequently than watering a little bit every day. A little bit every day just encourages the roots to be at the surface, which is where it's hotter and it's drier as the air dries out the soil. So deeper waterings are definitely better.
Well, also the time of day matters a lot, I think. I am an early morning person, and I like to get out there, even if I can, before the sun's completely up, to finish my watering. So I'm not cooking in the garden along with the plants, right? But to that early morning, you lose less through evaporation.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're losing less through evaporation, and also, for some plants, they may be a little susceptible to fungal diseases. So if you're watering at night and the leaves get wet, then they're sitting wet all evening when the air moisture is also higher. So watering in the morning is great for that, because the leaves can dry out and then they'll be dry, nice and dry for the day.
Yeah.
So I have this nice image of you watering your plants with your cup of coffee and your bathrobe. It just sounds really lovely in the morning.
Cup of coffee, but a ragged old pair of jeans, and that's it.
You don't want to offend your neighbors, right?
Yeah, a little bit disturbing, I think. Tom in the bathroom, not a pretty picture. But, again, time of day. One thing, I do this, and I don't know if it's wise or not, but you can give me a little feedback on it. I'm moving from plant to thirsty plant when I'm doing my hand watering. And for the plants in between, I might do a sprinkling once a week or something like that. But almost every day, in some of the thirstier plants that I water occasionally, I'll just kind of rinse their leaves off. And early in the morning, plants can take in moisture through the leaves, correct?
Yeah, I think that is nice to wash the pollen off and just keep them clean. Keeps the plants looking shiny and bright. Yeah, well, that's nice.
It's not something I spend a lot of time on, but I just a quick rinse down seems to keep them fresher in between the long infrequent waterings.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, okay, verification. All right. Are some? Real briefly, what are some of the tip-offs that people really should, drag out and do a serious watering? What are the real danger signs?
Yeah, well, if a plant is really wilty, you know, definitely if it's not too late, you can try to revive it.
Right.
And it's really important to make sure that you do a deep soaking. And you know, you think of a dry sponge, when you first get it wet, you know how the water just kind of rolls off and it doesn't really absorb too much. But if you water it again a couple times, then that soil will absorb more moisture.
I like that analogy. All right. Well, hopefully some people will have taken some clues from our conversation and be able to put this information to good use. And remember, if it's just a few drops of rain, you still got to pull out the hose or do some watering. So get to it. Andrea, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been always a pleasure to have you here. And coming up next is our friend Daphne.